Welcome. 2009. I vividly remember when Barack Obama was inaugurated as president. Needless to say, I had very low expectations of him. And these expectations were, I don't know, should I say they were exceeded or not exceeded? I'm not quite sure how to put it. But what came as a real shock was just a few months after his inauguration, the Nobel Prize Committee, Peace Prize Committee, announced that Barack Obama was going to be receiving the Peace Prize for that year. Up until then, I'd never thought very much about the Nobel Prizes or about the Peace Prize, but that really caught me off guard. And I remember at the time thinking, is the Nobel Peace Prize really just a piece of garbage? Is it really just all politicized nonsense? So that's inspired me to, because we've talked in some of my recent discussions with James, we've actually touched on the Nobel Peace Prize. We did a segment some weeks ago on the gentleman who started the Red Cross Association and the Geneva Conventions. He was one of the early winners of the Nobel Peace Prize. We also talked about Amnesty International a week or two ago, that they received the Nobel Peace Prize. But let's take a step back now and look at what is the Nobel Peace Prize and what are some of the most important controversies that have come up in the past half a century or so. So first of all, James, how are you doing today?
I am doing wonderful today. I hope you are too.
I am. And so let's just fill in a little bit of the context for our viewers who may not know so much about the Nobel Peace Prize. So Alfred Nobel was a 19th century chemist, engineer, and inventor. Dynamite was one of his inventions. And apparently he amassed a huge fortune. And at the time of his death in 1896, in his will, so he wanted to be remembered as a benefactor to humanity. So he had very specific ideas about how he wanted his fortune to be used. So he specified these prizes that would be awarded in different fields, scientific and non-scientific, to individuals who in the previous year had demonstrated some kind of benefit to humanity. And so specifically, there were the original Nobel Prizes were physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. Now, in terms of the first three prizes, the prizes in physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine, those are fields which are still to some extent ruled by a quasi-rational epistemology, where you feel that there is actually some room for objectivity in terms of evaluation and so on. Now, Nobel Prize in Literature, I just think is an absolute joke. When we're talking about 20th century, 21st century literature, the field is so hopelessly corrupt. What can you even say about that?
I have to stop you there. The famous folk singer from America, Bob Dylan, recently won a Nobel Prize in Literature for the lyrics to his songs. And I have to say that his poetry does not rank him among the great poets of history.
Absolutely
he's no Emily Dickinson. he's no William Shakespeare. And frankly, I could never stand Bob Dylan's voice. So the idea of giving Bob Dylan, a folk singer, the Nobel Prize in Literature kind of tells you how low it goes. You've got a whole list of famous authors. We were talking about Tolkien the other day. He never won the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Leo Tolstoy never won it. Marcel Proust.
Exactly. Some of the greatest. Mark Twain never got it. The father of American style literature, Mark Twain, never got the Nobel Prize in Literature. So, but Bob Dylan got the Nobel Prize. So that I had to make a little joke there because the Nobel Prize in Literature is, but you're absolutely right. The ones in the so-called hard sciences, physics, chemistry, physiology, medicine, those have actually been mostly granted to people who actually did do enormous achievements. One little footnote I want to put on that is that the United States has dominated the physical sciences. In physics, chemistry, medicine, those by far the number, if you break it down by nation, the United States is by far, get who's the second? The United Kingdom. When you put the US and the United Kingdom together, they account for a great share of all of the Nobel Prizes in the hard sciences, far and away leading the Nobel Prize recipients in the ones that you and I recognize as the more valid prizes that tend to get it right more often. But when it comes to, even worse than literature. Now, in the late 1960s, the National Bank of Sweden I think it was 1968, they instituted a Nobel Prize in economics. And that's been a mixed bag, truly a mixed bag. You have people like Hayek, who got it a year after Mises's death, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, James Buchanan.
Paul Krugman win as well.
But then, well, on the one hand, you've got some better economists that I named, and on the other hand, you've got, what was it, in 2008, Paul Krugman, one of the worst economists of our time, Paul Samuelson, the great advocate of Keynesian economics, who wrote the Economics 101 text for American colleges. He won the Nobel Prize. So economics is a mixed bag. The hard sciences are pretty solidly good, but this literature, and worst of all, the Peace Prize. Just think of the U.S. presidents who've won the Nobel Peace Prize. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the great warmongers in American history. He started the Spanish-American War. He wanted America to have an empire like the European powers. He was one of the great warmongers. Again, the next guy, Woodrow Wilson. Not just Teddy Roosevelt, then Woodrow Wilson, who drags America into World War I. So he insists on expanding the nations involved in the First World War, but he gets it for coming up with the idea of the League of Nations. Or take Barack Obama. When you look at the U.S. presidents who've won Nobel Peace Prizes, it tells you what a joke the Nobel Peace Prize was. Barack Obama had done nothing. It's true he was the first African-American elected president. And in my mind, that's really what he got it for. He hadn't done anything.
Was that what he got it for? Or was it really?
Had he done anything?
One possible theory is that the committee, it was a veiled criticism of the Bush administration. Basically, they saw it as a kind of a middle finger to George W. Bush.
Right. Well, George W. Bush, for all his mistakes.
In the same way that Jimmy Carter getting it in 2002 was a criticism of the start of the Iraq War, George Bush's war on terror and the weapons of mass destruction and all that. So, but definitely by the time we get to the 2000s, the Nobel Peace Prize is just so ridiculously politicized. It's not even worth discussing. Now there are a couple of criticisms. Going back a little bit further, there are some criticisms in terms of omissions, notable omissions of the Nobel Peace Prize that we may want to discuss. Mahatma Gandhi was nominated. He was nominated 5 times, and I think the last nomination was right before his assassination. It was something like 2 months before his assassination. And there's this rule among all the Nobel Prizes that if the person dies before the committee reaches a decision, you can't receive a posthumous award. You can only receive a posthumous award if you die after the decision has been announced. So now I would say we're probably not uncritical admirers of Gandhi. He had some very good things and some very bad things, some sort of anti-capitalist, anti-industrialist. He wanted everybody to spin their own cloth and not, but he also did some good things in South Africa, and he did some good things in India. So he's a notable omission as well.
I want to say something about Gandhi. I think that his policy of nonviolent resistance was brilliant. Just as a recipient, there was an American recipient who followed his policy. Martin Luther King followed very much the strategy of Gandhi, and he did win a Nobel Prize for his nonviolent resistance against racism in America. And I think that was
also Nelson Mandela. I would put in a similar
category. a similar category. And but Gandhi. I think the strategy of nonviolent resistance worked because it was the British. It was London newspapers that were reporting this, and he hit the conscience of the English-speaking world. He really did. And that's why it worked. If Gandhi were fighting, say, the Nazis or the communists, I don't think a nonviolent approach would have worked. I think Hitler would have just simply arrested and gassed the Mahatma. And but I think that, and I'm not saying that the British were blameless. No, they did horrible things in the subcontinent of India. But on the other hand, I think Gandhi's strategy worked to achieve independence for India because it was the British and the British public who was deciding these things. The English-speaking world was looking at it. If it had been, as I say, Hitler or Stalin, I don't think Gandhi would have been as successful. On the other hand, think about it. He creates this whole strategy of nonviolent resistance. I want to make a comparison. John Galt's strike in Atlas Shrugged is kind of a form of nonviolent resistance, not Gandhi. There's Ragnar out there saying you can use force, and when it's appropriate, use force. So it's not a Gandhi pacifism Ayn Rand is advocating, but it is curious to note that John Galt is sort of advocating a form of passive resistance. We're not going to cooperate with the system. We're just going to step away. And Martin Luther King does win the Nobel Prize for such a strategy. But it seems to me that even by their own terms, leaving Gandhi off the list.
Would you agree that passive resistance is appropriate in situations where you're clearly outgunned? Like there's no way that they could have, militarily used force against the British. Same with the Civil Rights March, where you're up against a much stronger power. Probably in those situations, nonviolent passive resistance is really the way to go. And same thing with Nelson Mandela and apartheid.
In both cases, it was effective because they could speak to the mostly democratic free speech worlds in the English-speaking world. If Martin Luther King couldn't appeal, see, I remember as a kid how he appealed to both left and right in my country because they were saying, yeah, there's something deeply wrong with institutionalized racism. We got to get rid of it. And so it worked because it was the American public. Gandhi worked because it was the British public. If it hadn't been among the democratic English-speaking, liberal-leaning English-speaking world, I don't think that strategy would work, as I say, against a Stalin or a Hitler. But you're absolutely right. When completely outgunned like that by the government itself, and boy, was Gandhi outgunned by the British Empire. If it was a matter of military force, the British could have stayed in India, and they didn't have to leave in the late 1940s. And that was the result directly of Gandhi's activities. So by their own standards, they screwed up. They're bad.
Yeah, and speaking of notable omissions in the view of many people, we talked last week about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So apparently Eleanor Roosevelt never received the Nobel Peace Prize, and some people see that as a serious flaw. Obviously, you and I would disagree with that criticism.
But she was the mother of the UN Declaration of Rights. And that, by their standards, it would seem to be a notable omission. She helped start a lot of this human rights concern, especially among the left of the last 60 years, 70 years. And she was left off the list.
Yeah. Now let's talk about some of the notable controversies. So 1973. Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho. Can we talk a little bit about that? And even at
neither of them deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, although America was negotiating for a long time the Paris Peace Accords, trying to end the Vietnam the conflict between Vietnam and the United States. It finally did wrap up and come to a conclusion.
But not until sometime after the award had been given. The hostilities still hadn't ceased at that time.
In fact, the Americans hadn't finally left until what, 76 or 75, something like that. It took 3 or 4 years more before the Americans were fully gone from South Vietnam. And the other guy who he got it with was this communist leader of the Vietnamese. So here you got the communist leader and Henry Kissinger, mind you. Now, the communist leader getting it is insane to me. That discredits the whole thing. It's like Yasser Arafat getting
we'll talk about him.
I'm jumping the gun here, but when you give the Nobel Peace Prize of all things to people like the father of the Viet Cong or to Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, this is your Nobel Peace Prize. That turns into perverse.
Didn't he invade South Vietnam shortly after that?
Yes, in fact, there was more aggressive activity from this Nobel Peace Prize winner afterwards.
Lots of people were killed, homes destroyed, all sorts of devastation.
Sneak violence, terrible violence that occurred after the guy won the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, Yasser Arafat, he refused to have a Palestinian state 25 years ago. He thumbed his nose right at it. And so this guy was an enemy of peace. He wanted violent hostilities to continue against the state of Israel until they were terminated, from what I can understand. This guy gets the Nobel Peace Prize.
So that was in 1994. That was in 1994. So it was Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres, and Yitzhak Rabin. The three of them won it together. Okay, so how do we unpack this trifecta?
Again, it's like Henry Kissinger and the Viet Cong guy getting it. I mean, you really have to unpack this in the most complex way. But it just seems to me that if you're giving the Nobel Peace Prize to aggressive communist dictators or to the head of the PLO who wants Israel wiped off the face of the earth, you read
A terrorist organization.
premises about the Nobel Peace Prize. What the hell are you even by any standards, what the hell are you doing giving the Peace Prize to such monstrous warmongers?
Okay, but what about Rabin and Perez? Do you think they should have gotten it at the time?
Well, they were compromised. Look at the effect of their compromises. Look at the effect of their lack of moral clarity here. A few years later, the same guy, Yasser Arafat, would be thumbing his nose and saying "F you" to any two-state solution when he could have had it. So the fact that they compromised with him came to the result that we're still not in peace. So that their approach, see, again, it's like Henry Kissinger. They're not of the moral degradation of Yasser Arafat. Henry Kissinger is not quite as bad as the leader of the communists from North Vietnam. On the other hand, these guys are morally compromised, and their approach obviously resulted in more violence and more disaster. So even giving them the Peace Prize, it seems to me, is dubious. Although they're not on the same moral plane, say, as Yasser Arafat or the head of the Viet Cong.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because back in 73, when Lee Duc-tho and Kissinger got the Peace Prize, there were a lot of satirists, comedians who were actually more critical of the fact that Kissinger
got it
than the North Vietnamese communist terrorist guy. Isn't that just ridiculous?
I'm sorry to laugh at such a serious topic, but it turns the prize itself into a joke. Who can take that seriously? And people who are saying Henry Kissinger is they're more critical of Kissinger getting it, or Itzhak Rabin. Now, I'm not a big fan of Itzhak Rabin, but more critical of Rabin getting it than Yasser Arafat. Now, think about that, how twisted your head has to be. It turns the thing, as I say, into a perversion, something upside down from any kind of real peace prize. Think about who really should have deserved the Peace Prize. Gorbachev gets the Peace Prize when the Soviet Union collapses. And I'm not saying Gorbachev wasn't a major, he gets some credit in my mind. He was the first leader of the Soviet Communist Party to actually open his mind up. But how did that really get motivated? It was the elections of Reagan and Thatcher that started all that. You know who I would have given the Nobel Peace Prize to when the Soviet Empire collapsed? Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I might have even included the Pope and the Lech Walesa, the Polish leader. These guys were the ones with their moral stance against communism who did more to bring down the Soviet Empire, that, in my view, than even Gorbachev did. The Soviet Union was a basket case. They were in trouble. Before Gorbachev took power, they went through how many leaders in 1 year? Andropov, boom, 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 boom. And it was only after Reagan and Thatcher's election and strong moral stance, and it was frankly Thatcher herself, the prime minister, who said, we can work with this guy Gorbachev, that gave the green light to further negotiations. It was, if anyone deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, Lady Thatcher, when she said, I can work with this guy Gorbachev, or when Ronald Reagan develops a military buildup in America that sort of corners the Soviets and walks out of the Iceland negotiations on intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe. Those things had more of an impact on bringing down the Soviet Union than anything. But you see, back in those days, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were just horrible right-wing warmongers as far as the left was concerned. It would have been inconceivable to them to actually give the leaders who helped bring down the Soviet Union the credit for it. That's inconceivable to these minds. Again,
so
it's a joke in my view.
Instead, they give it to Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama.
Right, exactly. Now, let me put it this way. I was happy, I must say, now full of all kinds of moral compromises, but the idea that Egypt and then later Jordan were absolutely willing to try and make peace with Israel was a good thing, all other things being equal. I think the Sinai deal was, again, you can break apart these things, but the point is, compared to what? When you're giving it to Yasser Arafat, when you're giving it to the leader of the Viet Cong, you've turned this thing not only into meaninglessness, like with Barack Obama, it's just empty meaninglessness. You've turned it on its head into a joke. You're rewarding warmongers. And I would have to say the same is true with these early American presidents who got it. In my view, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did more to get America into wars and stimulate the 20th century's wars and than anything else. Again, it makes it kind of a joke, an upside down perversion of what any kind of recognition of who's helping to bring peace to the world should be all about.
And what do you think of the idea behind the Nobel Peace Prize, that it's supposed to be given to people who've worked in favor of reducing standing armies, disarmament? Is that perhaps making the world a safer place for dictatorships and aggressors, as if we're disarming the more semi-free nations, right?
Right. And all of this implicit sanction of dictatorships. And think about it, dictatorship has been the cause of war in the modern world. It is
And the ancient world, for that matter.
Well, yeah, but if you think about just in the last 200 years, it's been the relatively authoritarian, the relatively totalitarian countries that have always started the wars, and it's always been the relatively democratic, peaceful, rights-respecting liberal nations that have had to fight back. Because a dictatorship is war, as Ayn Rand explained, by the government against its own people. When they run out of victims, they find victims abroad, and that very, very much fits the pattern, doesn't it, of the pattern of modern dictatorships. So when you sanction dictators like that, and this whole Nobel Peace Prize has in effect sanctioned all of these big, powerful dictatorships, yeah, we have to learn to live with them. What they're doing is simply helping to give moral support to horrible dictators, and at the end of the day, encourage more war, and not bring about peace. Whereas people who, if there had been a military buildup by the British before World War I, we might have avoided World War I. Thank goodness Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were getting tough morally and militarily on the Soviets. Only that really helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, standing up and calling them an evil empire, building up our nuclear weapons, not to use, but to say, you guys can't keep up with us. Those were the things that cornered Gorbachev into setting in motion the entire collapse of the Soviet empire. Those are the folks who, now, would I want a prize like that? Yeah, in theory. But guess what? It would be our values. I bet as objectivists, we could come up with a yearly prize for the person who did more to contribute to peace. But they wouldn't be these people who are always reducing armies, always calling for a compromise between evil and good. And look at all these compromises between evil and good that they're sanctioning with this award. Kissinger and the Vietnamese guy is a good one, or Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin is another one. Okay, they're sanctioning this stuff. They're not helping peace; they're hurting peace.
James, what do you think? We've talked a little bit about giving the Nobel Prize to organizations. We talked about Amnesty International a couple of weeks ago. So within the past decade, the European Union has received the Nobel Peace Prize. I like your reaction there. What do you think of that one? European Union.
Had the European Union had a correct attitude about Russia, we would not be looking at Ukraine today. Had the it's the European Union that actually deserves a finger wag. You guys were sanctioning Putin for so long that he felt the confidence to invade first the Crimea and now the whole of Ukraine. And the European Union deserves not a positive peace prize, but a negative peace prize for having encouraged Putin in recent years, it seems to me. And that's just for openers. They hate Israel. They generally speaking, and I could go on and on. The idea of giving do you think that there was going to be a war between Germany, France, Spain, Italy? I don't think so. I don't think the very existence of the European Union meant there was going to be peace in Western and Central Europe. It was a reflection of the peace that was developing in Europe, not a cause of it. On the other hand, what the Union has actually stood for has been compromises that, in my view, led to Putin invading Ukraine. So I think it's a perversion, my friend.
Absolutely. Let's check in with our producer, Daniel, to fill us in on any discussions, any chats or comments from our viewers.
We have a super chat from Robert Nasir. He says, "Happy birthday, Councillor Valliant."
Thank you, my brother.
Is it today?
Today I turn 60. It's the big 60 for me. I
Happy
share a
birthday.
birthday. I share a birthday with Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig von Mises and I have the same birthday. My wife's birthday was yesterday. She's a couple years younger than me. And 27 years ago, midnight last night, when our birthdays kissed, I asked her to marry me.
Oh,
So
that's
thank you, Robert. It is a very special day for my wife and me.
well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
We also Jeff has been a member for 17 months. Thank you so much, and he says happy birthday, James.
Thank you too, Jeff.
We also have a super sticker from Jeff again. Thank you so much, and also a super sticker from Ashley. She sends a birthday cake. So
Oh,
thank you everyone so much.
thank you guys. You guys are just way too sweet. Thank you very, very much. I'm very flattered.
Okay, well, I'll leave our birthday boy with the last word. Any final thoughts on the Nobel farce?
The Nobel Farce Prize. Yeah, that's exactly what it has been for a long time, and it's only gotten worse. The Nobel Prizes in peace and literature are simply a joke, in my view. And at least half the time, the Nobel Prizes in economics are. But as I say, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging achievement. I like the acknowledgement of achievement. We should acknowledge achievement, especially, I mean, where there is a kind, in physics, chemistry, medicine, these are heroes of humanity. Generally, these awards are given to real contributors. Such prizes are a great thing. It's just that in the areas of peace and literature, especially, these Nobel Prizes have become a perversion, a joke. They're not recognizing the people who help bring world peace in any objective way. And in literature, it's a corruption in my view too. So those prizes, especially the Peace Prize, are worse than empty in my mind.
Well said, well said. Daniel, do we have any announcements for today?
In about 4 minutes at 6 p.m. UK time, we have the reality show. Today's main topic is multiculturalism. Are all cultures equal?
Oh,
that sounds like a really fascinating topic.
Yeah, really good topic. Yeah. The ancient Aztecs that killed children on the top of their temple, when I went to college, we can't morally judge them as being any worse than the liberal democracies of the West. And I was just blown away by that thought. But that's got to be a fascinating one.
Yeah, and let me just quickly put in a plug for one of the upcoming Ayn Rand University courses. For those of you who haven't yet taken the Leonard Peikoff's 8 Great Plays, that was offered last year in Q1, Q2. It's going to be offered again this year. I'm going to be one of the TAs for the course. I'm going to be TAing together with Sam Weaver, who's excellent. I'm really looking forward to working with him. So yeah, if you're thinking of taking some ARU courses, you haven't signed up yet, there's still time. Leonard Peikoff's 8 Great Plays.
Check out Ayn Rand University, people. There's so much new stuff from sciences to literature. They're offering such a wonderful variety of stuff. Check it out. I'm so excited to hear you doing that, Nicholas.
Yeah, we're going to have our own Nobel Prize for best ARU courses or something like that.
Exactly.
Daniel, I see we still have a couple of last minute super chats, so let's please acknowledge those.
Thank you, Frank. He says, who can get a literature prize? And he says Stoppard and Pinken. I'm not
Tom
sure.
Stoppard, the playwright?
Yeah, Tom Stoppard or Thomas Pinken. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Oh yes, the novel. Yeah, well, maybe we can someday do a separate episode on the Nobel Literature Prize. That could be an discussion in itself. Anyway, I see we're out of time, so we'll wrap up. Again, a final happy birthday to my co-host, James. Look forward to chatting with you very soon. And to all our viewers and supporters, I wish you the best of premises.
Take care.